Imagine a king, born into power, yet constantly overshadowed. Was Louis XIII truly the weak puppet monarch history often portrays? Or was there a hidden strength and agency beneath the surface? Join us as we peel back the layers of his reign and uncover the surprising truth about the man behind the crown. He entered the world in 1601 beneath the vaulted ceilings of Fontainebleau, a cradle gilded in expectation. From the moment he drew breath, his mother, Marie de Medici, ruled in his name. France had lost its warrior king, Henry IV, to an assassin's blade, and a child of 8 suddenly wore the crown of a kingdom trembling between faiths. Courtiers bowed to the boy, but every gesture bent first toward his mother's throne. At court, the air itself seemed perfumed with intrigue. Italian advisors whispered in Latin, French nobles whispered in rage. The young Louis learned early that power could smile while holding a dagger. They say he preferred hunting to politics, silence to argument. Yet silence, in a palace, is not emptiness. It is the first language of survival. The corridors of the Louvre echoed with his tutor's footsteps, their voices drilling obedience, patience, and the art of listening without revealing thought. Servants saw a thin, solemn boy tracing patterns on the marble floors, fingers hovering where his father's blood had once stained Paris streets. Even then, he understood that a king's crown weighs less than his shadow. When he came of age, France expected a lion. It found instead a listener. But listeners remember. Beneath the stillness grew calculation. Beneath obedience, endurance. He would outlive his mother's regency, outlast conspiracies, and learn to rule through the only weapon no one suspected he possessed: control through restraint. Tonight, we will walk beside him through those corridors of velvet and fear, past the portraits that never smile, into the chambers where real decisions were made in whispers. Behind the polished mask of Louis XIV lies not weakness, but an intelligence sharpened by humiliation. To understand him is to understand how power hides itself, not in the roar of kings, but in the pauses between words. When Henry IV's blood dried on the cobblestones of Paris, the throne became both cradle and cage. At 9 years old, Louis XIII inherited a realm divided by faith, debt, and deceit. His mother, Marie de Medici, acted as regent, surrounding herself with Italian favorites whose accents grated against the pride of French nobility. The child king's signature appeared on every royal decree, but the hand that guided the quill was never his own. The boy grew among masks, velvet faces hiding ambitions sharper than swords. Courtiers bowed low, murmuring Votre Majesté, while measuring how far the Queen Mother would let them rise. Even his tutor, Cardinal de la Rochefoucauld, reminded him that obedience was safer than opinion. Louis listened, storing every slight behind the stillness of his eyes. They called him meek. He was memorizing the theater. France in those years was a mosaic cracking at its seams. Protestant towns defied the crown. Noble families hoarded soldiers like coins. The king's armies wore the fleur-de-lis, yet their loyalty was to whoever paid them last. Taxes starved peasants. Rumors of sorcery trailed through Paris streets. A lesser soul might have broken beneath the noise. Louis learned to breathe inside it. He found refuge in ritual, the measured click of rosary beads, the weight of armor, the silence of the hunt. Deer obeyed where dukes did not. In the forest, the boy who could not command men commanded nature instead, arrow true, gaze unwavering. The courtiers laughed at his isolation, not realizing solitude was becoming his strategy. When one lives surrounded by puppeteers, the only defense is to let the strings hang loose until they tangle. By adolescence, whispers spread that the king feared his own reflection, that he would never rule without his mother's consent. But fear has its uses. He watched her counsel like a hawk, pretending blindness, noting who flinched when her temper rose, who smiled too quickly at her jokes. Each gesture became a line in the private ledger of his patience. In 1617, the patience ended. Louis's favorite companion, Charles d'Albert, whispered what he had long rehearsed in silence. A king cannot serve two masters. The next dawn, the Queen Mother's minister, Concini, was shot in the courtyard of the Louvre. The boy king did not cry. He stepped over the blood and said, "Now I am free." The courtiers knelt, but none saw the faint tremor in his hands, the weight of freedom pressing where obedience once had rested. The crown was his at last, yet the chains had only changed shape. Freedom, for Louis XIII, arrived like a candle in a storm, briefly brilliant, then nearly smothered by wind. The death of Concini had torn the veil from his mother's rule, but it had not filled the void of governance. France, unsteady and suspicious, needed a mind sharper than the young king's caution. Into that emptiness stepped a figure who would define his reign, Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal de Richelieu. When Louis first met him, Richelieu seemed the perfect servant, soft-spoken, ascetic, eyes like wet slate. He promised order, not ambition, loyalty, not lust for power. The king, weary of deceit, saw in him a priest untouched by courtly rot. In truth, Richelieu understood power better than any noble alive. He entered the council chamber quietly and never left. Within a year, the cardinal's words threaded through every royal decree. Armies marched under his plans, ambassadors carried his voice abroad. Louis signed edicts written in another hand, but read them carefully. He was no longer the boy in his mother's shadow, yet now he cast none of his own. Courtiers whispered that France had two kings, one in crimson, one in blue. Richelieu's brilliance both terrified and fascinated him. The cardinal demanded obedience not only from ministers, but from conscience itself. He centralized power, crushed noble rebellions, subdued Huguenot strongholds, and stitched France into a nation bound by fear and reason. The king watched, sometimes admiring, sometimes shrinking from the enormity of what his own signature unleashed. But Louis was not idle. Behind the mask of acquiescence, he learned to play a subtler game, the politics of delay, of silence. When Richelieu sought immediate assent, Louis withheld it until night, forcing the cardinal to wait, to worry. The gesture was small, but in smallness lay assertion. Even puppets can pull back. In private, Louis hunted and prayed. His courtiers mistook retreat for weakness, yet in those forests and chapels, he discovered a discipline foreign to Richelieu's logic: endurance. The king's faith was obsessive, his piety austere. He slept little, spoke less, and confessed often. Where Richelieu ruled by intellect, Louis ruled himself through guilt. Between them existed a terrible symmetry, each incomplete without the other, each waiting for the other to falter. Once, after a council session, the king remarked quietly, "The cardinal and I are of one will, but only because he believes it is his." The jest held more truth than laughter. For 20 years their alliance endured, two predators chained to the same purpose: the survival of France. Historians would later call Richelieu the true architect of monarchy, the red eminence behind the throne. Yet Louis signed every decree, led every campaign, sanctioned every purge. A puppet does not bleed with his creation. He chose his tether, and by choosing, made it his instrument. In the end, the shadow Richelieu cast was not over Louis, but beside him. And in that shared darkness, the kingdom was reborn. Outwardly, France was being welded into strength, a single crown commanding obedience from fortress to frontier. Yet within the man who wore that crown, another battle smoldered, silent and unending. Louis XIII was a king who conquered nations but never himself. Behind the stiff brocade and the deliberate calm lived a mind gnawed by doubt and faith, a body that betrayed him, and a soul caught between command and confession. He was delicate from birth, frequent fevers, trembling fits, an exhaustion that no physician could name. The courtiers called it melancholy, the priests called it penance. Louis called it God's reminder that he was dust. His health ebbed and flowed with the fortunes of his realm. Victories in the field would restore his appetite, rebellions would steal his sleep. The more he controlled France, the less control he found over himself. His marriage to Anne of Austria offered little refuge. Their union was political theater, two dynasties sealing peace with silence. She was vivacious, foreign, fond of laughter. He, severe and guarded. Rumors of infidelity drifted through the corridors like incense. Each rumor wounded his pride and deepened his solitude. At night, he prayed until his knees bled on the cold chapel floor, asking forgiveness for sins he had never enjoyed committing. And then there was the matter of heirs. For more than 20 years, the cradle remained empty. Every year, without a child, carved another crack in his confidence. The courtiers whispered that God withheld lineage as punishment for his coldness. He endured their pity with the same patience he offered Richelieu's dominance. But the weight grew heavier. He loved France like a jealous husband and feared it would die with him. Inside his own mind, discipline warred with despair. He alternated between icy command and sudden tenderness, one moment signing death warrants for rebellious nobles, the next feeding his pet birds crumbs from the royal table. Those who served him found him impossible to predict. One ambassador wrote, "The king is a storm inside a glass. The calm deceives." In council, he sometimes froze mid-sentence, staring at a candle flame as though reading judgment in its flicker. Richelieu would continue speaking, pretending not to notice. Yet those silences carried authority. Ministers left the chamber unsure whether they had been dismissed or absolved. By the late 1630s, illness tightened its grip. The king's body wasted, his face hollowing into ascetic lines. Still he hunted, his hands steady even when his lungs failed him. That steadiness was defiance, a refusal to surrender to weakness, physical or political. France, after all, was watching. The man once mocked as puppet now moved an empire by will alone. Louis XIII fought no single enemy. His war was perpetual, against his mother's ghost, his cardinal's shadow, his body's betrayal, and the doubts that clawed at his faith. He would win some, lose others, but never lay down arms. In that struggle, the puppet became the hand that held its own strings. By the time the 1640s arrived, Louis XIII ruled from a throne made of silence. His presence dominated every chamber, not through volume, but through absence. When he entered, conversation dimmed, as if the air itself feared interruption. He had learned that authority spoken too often sounds like begging. True command is a whisper that others lean forward to hear. Richelieu, older and ravaged by illness, still wielded his pen like a blade, but the partnership that had forged France began to tremble. The cardinal's body failed, yet his will remained iron. The king's body failed too, though more quietly. Between them stretched two dying men, bound by necessity and habit, their alliance held together by exhaustion as much as purpose. They had become reflections, each completing the other's sentence, each half believing it his own. When Richelieu's enemies tried to exploit the distance growing between them, Louis answered not with speeches, but with action. He rode to the cardinal's bedside and assured him of faith and friendship. The gesture shocked the court. Rumor had promised revenge. But Louis had long since mastered the politics of contradiction. To betray his minister now would undo the work that defined his reign. When Richelieu died in 1642, the king wept privately. Those tears were not affection. They were relief and fear mingled. Relief that the shadow had lifted. Fear of what emptiness might follow. His final months were a slow retreat into devotion. He spent hours in prayer, hours more in contemplation, as though negotiating with eternity. The courtiers thought him morbid. The truth was closer to discipline. Every confession, every rosary bead, was an act of governance over the self. His physicians prescribed rest, but Louis answered, "A king rests only in death." At Saint-Germain, he kept his court small, preferring the company of chaplains and musicians. When music played, he closed his eyes and whispered the Latin verses under his breath, timing them with the rhythm of his weakening pulse. He ruled through stillness, as other kings ruled through decree. Even Richelieu, in memory, seemed to bow before that quiet. The birth of his son, Louis XIII, later Louis XIV, broke 23 years of barrenness. The miracle came too late to cure the father's frailty, yet it gave him peace. The dynasty would live, and through it, perhaps redemption. He held the infant only once, studying the tiny hands that would someday hold the scepter he had carried like a cross. "God has given France a king," he murmured, "and me release." When he rose from the cradle, those near him felt the final shift in the room's gravity. The boy's cry filled the air where silence had long ruled. The father smiled faintly, because even in being replaced, he had at last won the freedom he'd sought all his life. Spring of 1643 arrived cold and uncertain. The king's lungs had begun to fail, each breath rasping like parchment torn too thin. Courtiers whispered that he would not see another summer, yet Louis XIV continued his daily routines with almost military devotion. He still rose at dawn for Mass, still signed decrees with the same precise flourish, as though the ritual itself might postpone his departure. At Saint-Germain-en-Laye, his chambers were stripped of luxury. Tapestries muffled the draught, icons watched from the walls, candles burned with measured restraint. He spent long hours gazing out the window toward Paris, the city he had both feared and shaped. Its spires glinted in the distance, indifferent to the man who had made them safe. He once told his confessor, "The crown is a burden that teaches a man to die every day before he dies once." Doctors bled him, dosed him with tonics of crushed pearls and wine, prayed over him when medicine failed. He thanked them softly, knowing gratitude would comfort them more than it healed him. Each night, he dictated brief notes for his young son's future, warnings disguised as blessings. "Never rule alone, but trust no one completely," he wrote. "Kings are surrounded by mirrors, and every reflection lies a little." Anne of Austria watched from the shadows of the chamber. For years they had shared a polite estrangement, bound by duty, but divided by temperament. Now, in the stillness of his decline, they found a fragile tenderness. She read to him from the Psalms. Sometimes he closed his eyes, not from fatigue, but to remember what it had been like to believe those words were written for him. On the evening of April 13th, the rain returned. Lightning glowed faintly over the Seine. Courtiers crowded the antechamber, whispering prayers, exchanging glances that mixed piety with anticipation. In the king's room, a single candle burned beside the crucifix. Louis raised his hand toward it, fingers trembling. "There is my light," he murmured, "and there is my peace." Just before midnight, his confessor asked if he forgave his enemies. He smiled weakly. "I have none," he said. They were all teachers. A few moments later, his breath thinned, paused, and faded altogether. The clock in the corridor struck 12. 12 soft chimes for a reign that had lasted 33 years. Outside, the wind shifted. The same bells that had tolled for his father's death now rang for his own. Their echo carried across the fields to Paris, where a child slept in a gilded cradle. France would wake to a new monarch before the candle beside the old one burned out. At dawn, a thin mist veiled the palace gardens. The courtiers who had hovered all night straightened their collars and hurried to the chapel, their faces arranged into grief and relief in equal measure. The reign of Louis XIII was over. The reign of his son, not yet 3 years old, had begun. A priest murmured, "Le roi est mort. Vive le roi." The words echoed through corridors still smelling of incense and decay, binding continuity over death's interruption. Outside, church bells answered one another across the fields like a chain of ghosts. The city received the news with a curious calm. For decades, the people had called him the silent king, the obedient son, the man ruled by others. Yet the kingdom he left behind told another story. The armies he forged, the bureaucracy he built, the unity he enforced through Richelieu's hand, All these became the foundation upon which his son would build the splendor of Versailles. The puppet had left behind the strings that others would one day mistake for golden threads. Historians argued whether he ever truly ruled. Some saw him as a shadow between giants, Henry IV before him, Richelieu beside him, Louis XIV after him, but shadows too shape the light. It was Louis XIII who chose patience over chaos, discipline over indulgence, silence over spectacle. He taught a nation exhausted by civil war to breathe under order, even if that order frightened it. In a century of shouting monarchs, he whispered, and France listened. After his death, Anne of Austria governed as regent with Cardinal Mazarin, another pupil of Richelieu. The cycle continued, powerful ministers guiding fragile kings. Yet none repeated Louis's quiet mastery. He had worn obedience as armor and faith as leash, turning weakness into weapon. Behind the facade of passivity, he had been shaping the rhythm of monarchy itself, slow, deliberate, absolute. Centuries later, when the Sun King's court would dance beneath chandeliers, it was Louis XIII's ghost that lingered behind the music. Every rule of ceremony, every gesture of control, every silence enforced at Versailles traced back to the boy who learned to survive by listening. His greatest act of power was to make restraint look divine. Perhaps he was never meant to roar. Perhaps his destiny was to prove that a king could rule through absence as surely as others ruled through presence. Puppet, yes, but whose hand moved first? Theirs or his? As night falls over Fontainebleau, where his cradle once stood, the wind drifts through empty halls and carries the faint scent of candle wax. It smells like prayer, or memory. And if you listen closely, beneath the echoes of time and judgment, you might hear the quiet rhythm that guided him all his life, the heartbeat of a man who learned to command the world by mastering his own silence.